It's after 8 o'clock and time to bring him in. He's our film study professor. He takes us to film school on Fridays. It is Joe Fortunato with us. And today he is going to take us to film school on what is my favorite Hitchcock movie. And I'll let him take it from there. Joe, good morning, my friend, and take us to film school.
Well, good morning, Ray. Good morning, everybody. And yes, today we are going to celebrate the 65th anniversary, if you can believe it, of Vertigo, which was released May 9th, 1958. It premiered in San Francisco, appropriately enough, where the movie takes place. It was directed by the master, Alfred Hitchcock, starred Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak. It had 2 Oscar nominations for art direction and sound. Didn't win any. Ray, you mentioned it's your favorite. Vertigo has gotten a renaissance of critical love over the last couple of decades because it was actually somewhat poorly received by critics and audiences when it was originally released, and now it's pretty much considered Hitchcock's masterpiece. In fact, the numbers even bear that out. In 2007, the AFI 100 list that I refer to a lot ranked it at number 9 greatest movie of all time. When they did that list a decade earlier in 1998, it was listed at number 61. So it really leaped up there. Similarly, in the Sight and Sound poll, which is sort of the British version of that, in 2012, it replaced Citizen Kane as the number 1 greatest movie of all time. Wow. And then in 2022, just last year, it fell to number 2. So it's way up there in terms of critical praise and critical love. And what's kind of interesting about that, as I said, it wasn't really terribly well received when it came out, but it was actually unavailable for 3 decades because the rights, with a few other Hitchcock movies, had been bought by Hitchcock himself and given to his daughter as a legacy. So there was a period of time they were out of copyright, and it wasn't until around the 1980s, after a 30-year absence, that it kind of came back onto the scene, and that's when it started kind of gaining its momentum as one of the greatest movies of all time. I don't know if I agree with you. It's not even my favorite Hitchcock movie, but it's a great movie. So we can certainly agree with some of the experts.
I don't want to give anything away, but that ending of the movie is something else to me with this movie. But I know you like to get into the plot and the casting and everything. But so go down that road for us, Joe.
Yeah, well, so a couple of interesting firsts, if you want to call it that. The opening title sequence was designed by the great graphic designer Saul Bass, who ended up working a lot with Hitchcock in some of his movies and did the posters as well. This was actually the first movie to use computer graphics in the opening sequence, so that's kind of interesting. The famous zoom-in, track-in shot of what we sometimes call the Vertigo shot, also kind of known as the Jaws shot because it was used in Jaws as well. The contra-zoom, it's called the trombone shot. That was actually uncredited to one of the second unit cameramen that kind of came up with that. And Hitchcock had wanted to use that famous shot earlier in Rebecca, but they didn't have the technology to do it. So, if you haven't seen the film, then it's a little hard to describe, but most people have probably seen that even in clips where they kind of zoom in and pull out, and it gives Jimmy Stewart that sense of vertigo from the title. I mentioned this was already unavailable for a couple of decades. Hitchcock was actually kind of embittered a little bit towards the critical and commercial failure of the movie, and he actually blamed Jimmy Stewart for looking too old to attract audiences, and he never worked with Stewart again, and Stewart was one of his favorite collaborators prior to that. And additionally, many critics attributed the movie's failure to Jimmy Stewart, thought he was miscast. There was an age difference of 25 years between him and his co-star Kim Novak. Hitchcock also thought Kim Novak was miscast and the wrong actress for the part, which is kind of interesting since Hitchcock, of course, would have final say on who was cast anyway. But he kind of threw a little shade on his actors. Hitchcock was sort of famous for not being an actor's director. He was kind of hard on his actors. And one time when Kim Novak questioned him about her motivation in a particular scene, Hitchcock was alleged to have said, hey, Kim, let's not probe too deeply on these things. It's only a movie. So not a lot of direction there from Hitchcock.
When you look at the casting, you mentioned Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak. Barbara Del Getty's also in here. Went on years later in Dallas, of course, but she's also in the movie.
Yeah, she is. And there was a number of what might have been as well. We always like to go down the casting road. Audrey Hepburn had expressed some interest in playing the Kim Novak role. It was reported that Vera Miles was up for it and didn't get it because she was pregnant. Probably the most interesting what if was that Marilyn Monroe campaigned to be cast in that role, but Hitchcock thought that her immense fame would kind of overshadow everything else, and he wanted strict control over his projects. Passed on her, even though he was an approved list on the approved directors list that she could work with. But that's one of those great movie what ifs if Hitchcock had ever directed Marilyn Monroe.
I think she would have been perfect in that role, to be quite honest with you. But
I do too. I think Kim Novak was kind of young and green. Didn't have as much experience. Some people call her a little bit wooden. Of course, that's part what the role calls for, a little bit iciness. But yeah, it's interesting what might have been.
Vertigo, again, as Joe Fortunato is taking us to film school. Joe, anything else you want to pass along with us, Hitchcock great?
Well, Hitchcock himself was a little bit of a weird guy, an odd guy, and a little bit of a dirty guy, too. He one time was describing this movie to Francois Truffaut, who was interviewing him about his career. And Hitchcock said, he described the movie as, to put it plainly, the man wants to go to bed with a woman who's dead. So there's your summary.
All right, Vertigo, today's film school with film study professor Joe Fortunato. You can see it, listen to it over at WAKR.net. Joe, as always, my friend, thank you for the time. We'll do it again next Friday.
Look forward to it. See you next week.
You got it.